When you hear the phrase "the end of the Ice Age," what specific image comes to your mind? Most people imagine a beautiful, cinematic, and peaceful transition. They picture the heavy, dark gray clouds finally parting, the sun coming out to warm the frozen earth, the snow gently melting away into crystal-clear streams, and primitive humans happily throwing off their heavy mammoth furs to step into a warm, green, tropical paradise. It is a very comforting thought. It is also completely, terrifyingly wrong. The transition from the Pleistocene epoch to the Holocene epoch was not a peaceful spring morning. It was one of the most violent, unforgiving, and rapid ecological collapses in the history of our planet. For the ancient humans living through it, global warming wasn't a relief. It was an absolute, unmitigated apocalypse that destroyed their food supply, horribly mutated their environment, and nearly drove our species to complete and total extinction. Welcome back to our survival series. Today we are going to completely shatter the myth of the peaceful prehistoric thaw. We are looking directly into the nightmare of Pleistocene global warming, the total collapse of the prehistoric food chain, and the brutal, desperate technological revolution our ancestors had to undergo just to survive a world that was literally rotting and melting beneath their feet. To truly understand why the end of the Ice Age was such a catastrophic disaster, you first have to deeply understand the world that ancient humans had already conquered. For tens of thousands of years, the Earth was dominated by a specific, highly unique type of biome called the Mammoth Steppe. This was a massive, continuous dry grassland that stretched all the way from modern-day Spain, across the entirety of Eurasia, over the Bering Land Bridge, and deep into North America. It was the single largest biome to ever exist on Earth. Because the Ice Age locked up millions of cubic miles of the world's moisture in massive continent-spanning glaciers, the global climate was incredibly dry. This harsh, dry, freezing weather created a hard-packed, frozen dirt landscape. Fierce winds blew a fine, mineral-rich dust called loess across the plains, which acted as a natural fertilizer. This allowed the frozen ground to be covered in highly nutritious, nutrient-dense, deep-rooted grasses. This environment was the prehistoric equivalent of the modern African Serengeti, but frozen solid. It was the perfect ecosystem for massive herds of grazing megafauna. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinos, massive steppe bison, and wild horses roamed by the absolute millions. For a human hunter-gatherer, the Mammoth Steppe was the ultimate survival playground. It was an all-you-can-eat buffet of walking protein, dense bone marrow, and thick, life-saving animal fat. Homo sapiens evolved to become the ultimate, undisputed apex predators of this specific environment. We built our entire culture, our biomechanics, our weapons, and our survival strategies around tracking and hunting massive, slow-moving beasts on hard, flat, open ground with miles of clear visibility. We used heavy, thick, incredibly dense thrusting spears, like the famous Clovis points, specifically engineered to pierce thick hides and cause massive internal bleeding in elephant-sized animals. We built our homes out of mammoth jawbones and interlocking tusks. We burned animal fat to survive the freezing nights because trees were practically non-existent on the windy steppes. Our ancestors were the absolute masters of the frozen world. They had completely optimized their existence for the cold. But then, around 15,000 years ago, the planet's thermostat broke and the temperature began to rapidly rise. As the global climate warmed, the frozen ground beneath their feet, the deep, ancient permafrost, began to thaw. And this is exactly where the nightmare truly began. When thousands of miles of deep permafrost melts, the water doesn't just neatly drain away into the ocean. The flat, hard-packed Mammoth Steppe turned into an endless, inescapable, toxic mud bog. The Earth literally turned to soup. A geological phenomenon known as thermokarst occurred. As the underground ice wedges melted, the ground collapsed inward, creating millions of shallow, stagnant, freezing mud lakes. The nutrient-dense dry grasses that had fed the megafauna for 100 millennia began to immediately drown and rot. They were rapidly replaced by toxic, acidic mosses, aggressive peat bogs, and expanding marshlands that offered zero nutritional value to grazing animals. Imagine trying to survive in a world that is actively decomposing around you. As the ancient permafrost melted, it released billions of tons of trapped methane gas, filling the air with the horrific, suffocating stench of ancient, decaying plant matter and frozen carcasses that had been trapped in the ice for millennia. This sudden ecological shift was a brutal, inescapable death sentence for the megafauna. A fully grown woolly mammoth weighed up to 6 tons. They were biomechanical tanks, perfectly evolved to walk on solid, rock-hard, frozen ground. In this new, melting world, these magnificent giants sank up to their chests in thick, suffocating mud. They became trapped, physically exhausted, and unable to reach the shrinking patches of edible grass. Without their primary food source and completely unable to navigate the new, treacherous, swampy terrain, the massive herds that had sustained humanity for generations began to mass starve. Furthermore, the warmer, wetter climate brought a new, microscopic, and highly lethal enemy: disease. Thawing bogs became massive, continent-wide breeding grounds for prehistoric mosquitoes, ticks, and blood-borne parasites. The thick, woolly coats of the megafauna, originally designed to repel dry, powdery snow, now became waterlogged, heavy, and severely infested with insects and fungal foot rot. Within a geological blink of an eye, the giants of the Ice Age collapsed, suffocated in the mud, and went permanently extinct. And the predators followed them. The terrifying Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, evolved to hunt massive, slow-moving prey by grappling them and biting their soft throats. But when the mammoths and ground sloths died out, the saber-tooth had nothing to hunt. If a saber-tooth tried to hunt a fast, bony deer, its massive, fragile canine teeth would hit the deer's bones and shatter, leading to starvation. The short-faced bears, the dire wolves, the American lions, they all starved to death as the food chain completely imploded. For ancient humans, this was an unmitigated, existential catastrophe. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that your grocery store is completely gone, the roads are made of quicksand, and it is never, ever going back to normal. The absolute primary source of human calories, winter clothing, and structural building materials vanished into the mud. Mass starvation swept across the human population. The easy days of the Ice Age were officially over. But the melting ground and the extinction of the mammoths was only the first phase of the global warming apocalypse. The second phase was the terrifying rise of the dark forest. As the climate continued to warm and the atmosphere became exponentially wetter, dense, impenetrable forests of pine, birch, spruce, and oak aggressively expanded across the former steppes. To a modern human living in a concrete city, a forest seems like a beautiful, peaceful place for a hike. To an Ice Age hunter perfectly accustomed to wide-open plains where they could spot prey or predators from 5 miles away, the dense, creeping forest was a claustrophobic, terrifying, and highly dangerous alien world. Visibility instantly dropped from miles to mere feet. The old prehistoric hunting tactics became entirely, laughably useless. You cannot organize a massive, coordinated tribal ambush when you cannot even see your fellow hunters through the thick, tangled brush. You cannot throw a heavy, 2-meter-long mammoth spear in a dense forest. It will immediately deflect off a tree branch and alert every animal in the area. Worse yet, the animals that actually survived the extinction event were completely different from the megafauna. The new world belonged to red deer, wild boar, elk, roe deer, and rabbits. These animals were small, incredibly fast, highly skittish, and perfectly camouflaged. If you stepped on a single dry twig, or if the wind shifted your scent by 1 degree, they would vanish into the thick underbrush like ghosts before you could even raise your weapon. Humanity was starving to death, trapped in toxic muddy bogs, and lost in dark, claustrophobic forests, surrounded by incredibly fast prey they simply could not catch. To survive, the human brain had to execute the greatest and most rapid technological pivot in the history of our species. We had to stop relying on brute, muscular strength and start relying on advanced physics and mechanical engineering. Out of pure, desperate, bleeding necessity, our ancestors underwent what archaeologists call the Microlithic Revolution. They realized that the large, heavy, beautifully crafted stone spearheads of the past were completely obsolete. Instead, they began meticulously crafting microliths, tiny, razor-sharp, geometric blades of flint and obsidian, some no larger than a fingernail. But how do you kill an animal with a piece of stone the size of a coin? You become a prehistoric chemist. Our ancestors figured out how to extract pitch and tar from birch bark by heating it in an oxygen-deprived fire, creating a highly durable, waterproof superglue. They used this birch tar to glue rows of these tiny microblades into lightweight, aerodynamic wooden shafts. But a light, aerodynamic projectile needs a completely new delivery system. You cannot throw it by hand. It lacks the mass to penetrate deep tissue. It needed a mechanical engine. It needed a mechanism to store and violently release kinetic energy. This desperate era of starvation and adaptation birthed the ultimate weapon of the prehistoric world, the bow and arrow. The invention of the bow completely leveled the playing field in the dense, dark forests. A hunter could now remain completely silent, crouched, and hidden in the brush. They didn't need to get dangerously close to the prey and risk spooking it. By twisting animal sinew or plant fibers into a high-tension string and bending a flexible piece of yew or ash wood, they created a lethal spring. With the release of 2 fingers, they could launch a lethal microlith-tipped projectile through tight gaps in the trees at devastating highway speeds. They could take down a fast-moving deer before the animal's nervous system even registered the sound of the snapping string. But human ingenuity didn't stop at the tree line. Because large game was no longer a guaranteed daily meal, the human diet had to become incredibly diverse and highly opportunistic. This is the era where humans transitioned from being simple mammoth killers into master multi-environment survivalists. We invented complex woven snares and deadfall traps to automatically catch small game like rabbits, badgers, and foxes while we slept. But most importantly, we turned our eyes to the water. The melting glaciers had created massive, swollen river systems, expanding coastlines, and millions of new lakes. Humans engineered the first sophisticated barbed bone harpoons. We wove massive, complex nets out of willow bark and plant fibers. We built massive wooden fish weirs, underwater fences designed to trap migrating salmon and eels. We turned the terrifying floodwaters from an apocalyptic obstacle into an infinite, self-replenishing source of dense marine protein and omega-3 fatty acids. We also domesticated our greatest former rival. We turned the wild, aggressive Ice Age wolf into the specialized hunting dog. In the low-visibility environment of the forest, human eyesight was heavily limited, but a dog's nose could track a wounded deer through miles of dense brush, completely neutralizing the forest's camouflage advantage. We stopped being pure terrestrial apex predators and became highly adaptable, omnivorous foragers. We figured out how to detoxify wild roots by boiling them with hot stones. We learned how to harvest acorns, leach out the toxic tannins, and bake them into dense survival bread. Humanity survived the global warming apocalypse because we literally engineered our way out of it. But the Earth is a chaotic and unforgiving host. It had one final, breathtakingly cruel trick up its sleeve. It was the ultimate punishing test of human resilience. Just as human populations had finally adapted to the warmer, wetter world, just as they had perfected their bows and their fishing nets, the global climate violently, aggressively snapped back. Around 12,900 years ago, an anomalous geological event occurred known as the Younger Dryas. Remember those colossal freshwater lakes formed by the melting glaciers? Geologists believe that a massive, towering ice dam holding back Lake Agassiz in North America catastrophically collapsed. It dumped billions upon billions of tons of freezing, purely fresh meltwater directly into the North Atlantic Ocean in a matter of weeks. Ocean currents are driven by salt density and temperature. This sudden, unimaginable influx of cold, fresh water completely disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the deep ocean current that acts as a conveyor belt, bringing warm water from the equator up to the northern hemisphere. The Gulf Stream simply shut down. The result was an apocalyptic climate whiplash. In a matter of just a few decades, or possibly even within a single terrifying human lifetime, global temperatures plummeted aggressively back down to absolute Ice Age minimums. Imagine the sheer psychological devastation. Your tribe has spent dozens of generations forgetting how to survive in the extreme, brutal cold. You have fully adapted to wearing lighter clothes, hunting in green forests, and fishing in liquid lakes. And suddenly, the brutal, biting winters become lethal again. The massive lakes freeze completely solid, destroying your fishing nets. The newly grown broadleaf forests rapidly die back, unable to survive the plunging temperatures. The freezing, dry, howling winds return with a vicious vengeance. During the onset of the Younger Dryas, human populations plummeted across the northern hemisphere. Entire settlements and ancient camps were completely abandoned. People who had discarded the heavy, complex mammoth hide sewing techniques of their ancestors had to desperately relearn how to make extreme winter clothing just to survive a single night. This era forced the perfection of the bone needle with a drilled eye. Humans had to quickly hunt animals not just for meat, but to meticulously tailor incredibly tight-fitting, multi-layered, wind-proof clothing using animal sinew as thread. A loose gap in a coat meant instant frostbite and death. They abandoned open-air camps and began digging deep into the frozen earth, building semi-subterranean pit houses insulated by dirt and roofed with heavy turf to trap the heat of indoor hearths. It was a brutal, unforgiving, and ruthless genetic bottleneck. Only the absolute smartest, the most paranoid, the most technologically advanced, and the most fiercely adaptable tribes managed to endure this horrific climate roller coaster. The Younger Dryas deep freeze lasted for roughly 1,200 brutal years before the Earth finally slowly warmed again, eventually stabilizing into the Holocene epoch, the relatively calm, warm climate era that we have enjoyed for the last 10,000 years, the era that allowed us to invent agriculture, build cities, and ultimately conquer the globe. When we look back at the end of the Ice Age, we should never view it as a natural, peaceful progression into a better, warmer world. We should view it as a terrifying, relentless survival gauntlet. The Earth actively tried to drown our ancestors, starve them to death, trap them in toxic mud, blind them in dark forests, and then freeze them to death all over again in a final act of climatic betrayal. But it completely failed. You exist today because your ancient ancestors were the ultimate biological shapeshifters. They watched the mighty, untouchable giants of the Earth die out. They watched the very ground rot beneath their feet. And instead of giving up and going extinct like the megafauna, they looked at the changing world, tapped into their massive frontal lobes, and fought back. They invented the bow and arrow, they tamed the savage wolf, they built the first boats, they mastered the chemistry of fire and adhesives, and they conquered the dark, terrifying forests. They were quite literally forged in the fires of climate chaos. When you look in the mirror, you are not looking at a fragile creature. You are looking at the genetic legacy of the most stubborn, resilient, and brilliant survivors this planet has ever produced. If this deep dive into the brutal, chaotic reality of prehistoric global warming completely changed how you view ancient humans, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below what terrifying era of human survival or prehistoric nightmare you want me to break down next. Stay safe, stay highly adaptable, and I will see you in the next one.